Was the Ferguson grand jury process fair, or was it stacked in favor of Officer Darren Wilson and against Michael Brown Jr.? The New York Times says, quote, the gentle questioning of Officer Wilson and the sharp challenges prosecutors made to witnesses whose accounts seem to contradict his narrative have led some to question whether the process was as objective as the prosecutor claims. Here's what the prosecutor said about witness testimony when he announced the decision.
Eyewitness accounts must always be challenged and compared against the physical evidence. Many witnesses to the shooting of Michael Brown made statements inconsistent with other statements they made and also conflicting with the physical evidence.
But the witnesses who were challenged most were the ones testifying against Officer Wilson, like one who said Michael Brown Jr. had his hands in the air. The prosecutor told that witness, quote, basically just about everything you said on August 13th and much of what you said today isn't consistent with the physical evidence. But we saw a very different approach with Officer Wilson. For example, prosecutors asked about the moment he shot Michael Brown by asking, quote, you felt like your life was in jeopardy, and, quote, use of deadly force was justified at that point, in your opinion. The tone is striking. In fact, the questions seemed tougher in that TV interview than they did in the grand jury.
You say he starts to run, does a stutter step, starts to come towards you, and?
At that time, I gave myself another mental check. Can I shoot this guy? Legally, can I? And the question that I answered myself was, I have to. If I don't, he will kill me if he gets to me.
Even though he's, what, 35, 40 feet away?
Once he's come in that direction, if he hasn't stopped yet, when's he gonna stop?
Joining me now is former U.S. Attorney Kendall Coffey and retired ATF agent Jim Kavanaugh. Thank you both for being here.
Thanks, Reverend.
Kendall,
thanks, Reverend.
Kendall, what do you make of the prosecutor asking you felt like your life was in jeopardy? I mean, does that strike you as odd?
Well, I feel pretty clearly that rather than a leaderless grand jury investigation, this was a grand jury that was being led to a conclusion of innocence. Think of it. It's just the questions a defense lawyer would have asked Officer Wilson. Didn't you feel like your life was in jeopardy? Well, of course you know what the answer is going to be. Didn't you feel like, in effect, that the shooting was justified? Not only does that tell the witness to say he's innocent, it tells the grand jury members there in the room that this prosecutor is signaling very clearly that the prosecution thinks that Officer Wilson is innocent. So in some of the most critical stages of this entire process, the prosecutors, rather than being neutral, were basically stepping over to the defense team.
Jim, you question why prosecutors didn't wait until the end of the grand jury process to call Officer Wilson. What's important about that?
Well, Reverend Allen, Kendall will tell you this as well. In an investigative grand jury process, I've been involved in many of those, and you gather all the information, your witnesses come in, you're trying to put the case together. The target of the investigation, in other words, the investigation of who would get charges preferred against them if the grand jury returned a true bill. Normally, you would bring it at the end based on a target letter that the United States attorney or the district attorney would put out. You don't let the person set the narrative and then everybody has to, see if it falls in place. You gather, in other words, the grand jurors would know everything, and then the person who would be possibly criminally charged would come in, and then they would decide. So you could test his statement against all the other statements. In investigations, that's what we like to do. The target we like to get last, not first. So what happened here, when the officer goes in, then everybody's tested against his statement. If that doesn't match his statement, then it's rejected as not true or not right. But, inconsistent witness statements is the norm in every case. Certainly, to even bring up a witness who makes some fantastical claim that Michael Brown was shot in the head and shot in the ground, and it's so fabulous, it would be so rejected. We would never have that person call it a trial at a grand jury. We would just totally reject that. So to present that to the grand jury, I don't think that's a fair process either.
Kendall, you know, here's an example of two different accounts. One from Officer Wilson, the other from Dorian Johnson. It's about whether Mike Brown reached toward his waistband. Listen to this.
When he stopped, he turned and faced me. And as he does that, his right hand immediately goes into his waistband. My initial thought was, is there a weapon in there?
His hands were never at his waist. He had on basketball shorts. Didn't have a belt on, so it wouldn't stay at his waist. Even if he did have anything at his waist, it wouldn't stay at his waist.
Now, couldn't a prosecutor argue the physical evidence doesn't support Officer Wilson's account?
Exactly, and just as Jim described, you put the target on at the end if they want to come in without immunity, and then you confront them. You've had presumably a number of witnesses, a number of important pieces of information and the physical evidence, and you aggressively and intensively cross-examine them. You don't simply put them in there to tell their story with the aid and the assistance of a couple friendly questions from the prosecutor. That's a great example of a key point that the officer was allowed to say basically unchallenged. That kind of failure to challenge the target, if he walks into a grand jury investigation, is something that never happens. Targets are aggressively, relentlessly challenged by prosecutors who are serious about exploring a prosecution.
Jim, Officer Wilson said he pursued Michael Brown to prevent Brown from attacking someone else. Quote, "What would stop him from doing what he just did to me, to him, or worse? Knowing he has already done it to one cop, he still posed a threat not only to me, to anybody else that confronted him." Does that make sense to you, or should prosecutors have followed up?
You know, you can assess that yourself. Is that really a believable statement? I mean, it's a statement that the officer says that, you know, allows him to use deadly force even when the guy's fleeing. I mean, is this guy really an imminent danger to every other citizen? Where is that evidence? He was involved in a strong-arm robbery, where he stole the cigars and pushed the clerk. He's involved in an assault on the officer. He slapped and punched the officer, probably at the worst case. And a fight over the gun, let's take all that as say it's true. He doesn't necessarily pose a great imminent threat to the public at large. It wouldn't be a situation where you could shoot him in the back. But the officer seems to feel that that is okay, that he poses this great danger to the public at large. I don't think that's a valid argument, but I don't think it would come into a test of excessive force because he wasn't shot in the back. I think the excessive force case here comes when he was shot in the front, in the first volley of shots, at a great distance, where he was shot probably in the upper arm with an upward trajectory. That doesn't indicate to me that he was bending over. He was walking toward the officer. There's a number of witnesses that talk about, you know, hands in front at different stages. But nevertheless, I mean, out here and maybe incredulous, why, what's going on? And he gets shot with this volley and pauses and then comes forward staggering, stumbling, or charging, maybe to save his own life if he's trying to surrender and being shot. So the excessive force case to me is not at the car. It's not when he's running away. It's when he's shot from a distance and he's unarmed. And that's what the Department of Justice, and Kendall can elaborate for us, Reverend Al, the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, who I have a lot of confidence in, and the FBI as well, to put this together and see if this really will hold. Is it an excessive force case? That's the first question they need to answer for America. Is it? Not can they prosecute it, can they prevail, can they win a trial? First, is it or is it not an excessive force case? And then they need to go from there. And they will have all the evidence, map it out, put the stopwatch on it. He only traveled 25 feet. Get that thing tightened down and get the answers to the public.
I'm out of time, Kendall, but suffice it to say, bottom line, this is very unusual in many areas.
Yeah, it's extraordinary, and it doesn't show an even-handed treatment of a process of the people involved.
Kendall Coffey and Jim Kavanaugh, thank you both for your time tonight. Have a good Thanksgiving.
Hey, thanks, Reverend.
Thanks, Reverend.